a lot of times we think that we have to consistently come up with new topics and new ideas. And when I looked at people within the business to business space, people like Gary Vee, Alex Hormozy, Cody Sanchez, one thing I've noticed is they actually kind of say the same stuff a lot.
That's Joel Lalgee. But if you've ever been on the job search side of the internet, you probably already knew that. Joel has gained over 500,000 followers by creating thousands of videos over the past 2 years. Today, he's breaking down the counterintuitive secrets to creating recruiting content that actually works.
So I think a great recruiting content, you understand your candidates or your clients and what they care about, and that's what you're posting about.
From mastering repetition to leveraging your expertise, Joel shares how to create content that attracts candidates, impresses hiring managers, and establishes you as a trusted voice in recruiting. Let's dive into my conversation with Joel. So, you've built an incredible presence on social media. You've got, I think the last time I checked, around 500,000 followers across like your platforms, and you're known for like authentic and engaging content. What inspired you to start creating content alongside your recruiting stuff that you do?
Yeah, so I don't know if anybody out there remembers this or if you remember this, but there was a time on LinkedIn where there was no video. And then suddenly, I think it was 2017, they started to introduce video on the platform. And I actually had a friend who was one of the first people who started producing videos on LinkedIn. And she would just go viral because, sometimes when they introduce new features, they really push it. And so she went really viral. And so I was like, oh, that's really interesting. I don't, and I, in my head, I was like, maybe I'll do some video one day, and just went back and forth in my head for like years and years. But the resonating message from people with video was, if you can create video that's good and engaging, you don't have to reach out to people. They'll come to you. And being a recruiter on the agency side, full desk recruiter, a large portion of my job was selling people. And a large portion of sales is reaching out to people. And a large part of reaching out to people is getting rejected. And I don't like getting rejected. It hurts. It's like the worst part of the job. So this message around, if you can create a brand that people like, that people trust, you don't have to do that anymore. So that's really what inspired me to do it. And I think on top of that, when I started doing it, it was like I had that inspiration moment. And then when I started doing it, I just quickly realized, number one, I really enjoy the process. And then number two, I thought at that time I was pretty good at it. And I was creative. And now looking back at some of my original content, that was not the case. But I believed I was, and that was enough to keep me going.
Yeah, that's always the struggle when I look back at like my first videos. I'm like, can we take this off the internet?
I know. Luckily, with
me.
LinkedIn, you don't go viral right away. So I feel for people who make one video and go viral, and it's like, that's gonna be your worst video ever. And now everyone, that's what they're gonna remember you by.
I know. Every time I see a cringe video, I'm like, I need to create more to push that down, like further away so no one sees it. So talking about video, I read a post of yours the other day that you've created 5,000 videos in the last 2 years. That is a lot. How do you find the topics for your videos?
Yeah, I think I'll start by saying I think when we think of the topics for videos as individuals, a lot of times we think that we have to consistently come up with new topics and new ideas. And when I looked at people who, particularly within the business to business space, so outside of the entertainment arena, so I'm not talking about YouTubers like Mr. Beast or like, Logan Paul, Jake Paul, those guys. When I look at people in the B2B space who are big name, big creators, I think of people like Gary Vee. I know like Alex Hormozy has joined the scene, Cody Sanchez. You have these like influencers, and one thing I've noticed, and I just noticed with looking at a lot of these people, is they actually kind of say the same stuff a lot, and they repeat, and they just say it in different ways. Sometimes they even say the same exact thing. And I think really quickly I realized the reason you can do this is because in our mind, we think all that person's watching that day is our video, and that they're somehow going to remember it. What I found is we don't really remember individual videos from people per se. We just as a whole know them. And so my topics, like, and with that being said, it doesn't mean you just have to have one topic, but I've built my topics around recruitment, career, and then corporate. And so, and then, if I was to break those topics down, I'd say corporate, we might have remote work, might have like flexibility, trust within the workplace, so like corporate politics. Maybe there's some advice in there. And then career, or sorry, job search and career, we're looking at resumes and like interview tips. And then recruitment, we might look at ghosting, or best practices, or some humorous types of ways to work with hiring managers. So kind of like have broad topics and then break those topics down into smaller segments. But I do not stray away from those topics. With the exception of on LinkedIn, I'll occasionally post things about my personal life, occasionally. But if you look at any of my video platforms, I don't really talk a lot about my personal life. Maybe on Instagram, I do some stories that are personal because people seem to like those. But I just stick with those topics. And then I say a lot of similar things and then just try and say those things in different ways. But that helps with the creation process because then I'm not constantly feeling that pressure to reinvent the wheel or come up with something new, which I think can be a challenge, right? Because if you're 10 videos in and you're feeling like, oh, I've got to talk about something new, that you have limited, if you niche down and you have topics, then there's just going to be limitations with that.
Yeah, I always tell people when I talk to them about like this and they ask me about how to get ideas, it's like the best videos, your best content is actually the stuff that you're absolutely bored of talking. Like, you're doing good when you yourself are like, oh my gosh, I have to talk about this again. But the truth is, no one remembers it, really. Like, even people who watch all of your videos or everything, you say the same thing in a different way. And no one, and everyone's like, oh, I love this. I love this. So,
Well,
yeah,
we
that's
we really overestimate the impact of our own content a lot of the times. And again, one of the most common things I get is, "Oh yeah, I've seen some of your content. Oh, I like that meme you shared the other day." And I'm like, "You've reduced all of my 5 years of work of content to a meme." But that's just the nature of the world that we live in, and you're not just battling against, or I shouldn't say battling because I don't like to use that terminology, but you're not just out there on an island by yourself. You're competing against other people on the platform for attention. You're competing against Netflix, right? You're competing against the news. You're competing against LinkedIn games, LinkedIn news. There's a lot of competition for attention, and because of that, I think about advertising. With this, it's like, well, Toyota has the same commercial. They'll play the same commercial for 2 months straight. There's a reason for that, and it's because they're anticipating that people aren't going to really remember it, and they need to reinforce the ideas. And so understanding that, I think it takes off a lot of pressure as well. And it's just helpful to know that. Because again, I think when people, that's one of the big things that holds people back, right? Is just, what am I going to talk about? So I think relieving yourself of that is huge. And then the other question then is like, well, where do you get the time for that? And again, it's you get better the more videos you get. Like at first it took me a long time, and then video 3,000. You get 3,000 into it. Now I'm at a point where I can create 10 videos in 20 minutes because there's not as much going back and editing. I know what I'm going to say. I say it, and that's it. Whereas at the beginning, it was a little bit, for a 5-second video, I might spend 20 minutes making it, and so then that kind of becomes a cheat code because the more you do, the better you get, and you can't skip that process either.
Yeah. So, can you walk us through your content creation process?
Yeah, I can. I can try. I would say the first thing to think about now is like, I don't. There was a time where I would sit down and plan things out, and so this was very early in my LinkedIn journey, which is where I started. I would have topics picked out for each day. Now, I'm the type of person who, and I think you got to know the type of person you are. I'm the type of person who, I'm not a planner by nature, and there's actually something I enjoy about not knowing what I'm going to post, which plays into the fact of why I enjoy doing things. So a lot of things are in the moment, but at the beginning it was very much, hey, I'm going to post a video on this topic, on maybe cold emailing candidates. Now I'm going to post an image about my kid. Now I'm going to do a poll on this topic. So I'd have like a brief map set out. That's how I did it earlier on. Now it is very much, and again, now to give some context to this, dude, this is my full-time job. So I don't have any other job. This is literally what I do. So now it is very much like, I'll just have an hour of time in the morning. hour time in the afternoon. And usually what I'm doing now is like reacting to a lot of things or like getting a feel for like what are people talking about, what's in the news, and then finding things I have opinions on and thoughts on, and then I'm just creating things in the moment. So it's gone from planning and having like a framework, which I think you need to have at the beginning to keep yourself accountable, to now it's very much in the moment. So I'm also huge on repurposing content. And so when you look at like just how many platforms I'm on, I mean, I'm on pretty much every platform you can think of, but I've learned which platforms are interchangeable with content, which ones aren't. And and then and because of that, I might say one thing on LinkedIn a certain way, and then say the same thing on Threads, but in a Threads way, and then I might take that, right, and they could be two written posts, and then make a video on what I just wrote about. So I've gotten really just a good understanding of how to say the same things in the way that people that are going to respond on the platform, and and then understanding like, hey, if you write something, you can literally do a video on what you wrote. And so that's that's my thought process. So I might have a topic that I really am passionate about, and maybe on LinkedIn, maybe I do a 2-liner that says, be careful who you trust at work, you might get burned. Okay, so that's 2-line, and then I can tweet that because it's so short. I can put that on Threads, maybe mess around with the verbiage a little bit, but then I could do a video on that and say, guys, be careful who you trust at work, and tell a little bit of a story around it with the video. So that I think when I think of content creation, it's like have the topic, understand each platform, and then just kind of create similar content, which kind of goes back to what we said with that, with the earlier point of just having those topics established and knowing what you're going to talk about. The last thing I'll say with that is I think it just takes time to get to that point. And I think this is a part that's really hard, is like you can't just start out and be like, well, this is it. This is my message. You almost have to start speaking and putting yourself out there to figure out like your voice and what you're about. I think some people, if you're starting out of nowhere, it's going to be like that. Maybe if you've done public speaking or you've done like leadership training, you might have that a little bit more thought out. But I think for a lot of people, you kind of figure out that voice and what those topics are through actually just creating and doing it. And so it might start out one way, and then you see it evolves and it changes over time as well. So I don't know if you experience that as well.
Yeah, I've experienced that because it's like you said, I have kind of similar way of doing it like you, as far as I have my topics and I just know that these are the 4 or 5 things that I talk about, and I don't have that. I wish I had like a calendar full with like, oh, I've
Me
got
too.
2 weeks, 3 months full of, no, I don't.
Yeah,
So yeah, you just get used to it. But I think the most important thing that you've said and that I want, and I always say, and I want everyone to remember, is the more you do it, the better you get. And then you have that moment where you're like, okay, this is me. This is online Rona. It's the same Rona as real life Rona, but this is online Rona's voice. Because when I do this, this is what works. I know exactly what types of post are the ones that my audience resonates with. I know my emails that work. I know it. And I occasionally try other things because I'm just human and I want to try other things. But you just get to a point where but that happens after doing it over and over and over again.
100%. Yeah, and it's so interesting because there's a lot of different factors. Because I do think there's an online persona that kind of happens because it's a one-way communication, but I think the authenticity comes in, and I'm seeing this a lot more. And again, to give some context, like I started probably really getting into content creation about 6 months before. Yeah, it was about 6 months before COVID, which is when a lot of people jumped on. So I was kind of like I was like early on, kind of before that wave of people that came in, which already kind of gave me an advantage because I was already a little bit more established. But one thing I hadn't done is I hadn't really done networking in real life a lot. And in fact, when I would go to networking events, I was really uncomfortable all the time because I always had that pressure of selling and, again, being a recruiter. Tell me what you do. Tell me about your business. And you get your sales manager like, if you're going to go to this event, you better come back with 7 leads that we're going to turn into business. And because of that, I just had like a phobia of events because I just genuinely enjoy meeting people. but I genuinely enjoy meeting people most when I don't have an agenda, and it's so hard to balance that when you're in sales. So I say all that because now when I go to events, like I went to an event last night, like a small dinner, and definitely the dumbest person in the room, which is always where you want to be. Like
Yeah.
that's when you know you're in a good room, when you're just like, wow, these people have amazing experience, and I'm like learning a lot and seeing different perspectives. But I was talking about some of the messages that resonate with people with my content. And I think in those settings now, I'm seeing like there's definitely a way to do content, and there's a persona that's kind of out there. But I think when people meet you, that authenticity is if there's a really vast difference between your message and what you're saying and how you communicate, or for example, if you're like, hey, I really care about people and people are amazing, and you're putting all this inspirational stuff, then when you meet people, if you are kind of just not nice, or you're not asking questions, or you're not engaging, then that can cause a huge issue. So, but it's like balancing that, and then it's also going, okay, well, I have an audience here. And what I found is like audiences shift, and like what's going on shifts as well. So you almost have to, you got to cater to the audience to a certain degree, and then stay authentic. And and that's hard. It's such a hard balance. And let's face it, when you talk about like virality, and you talk about things that are like mass appeal, this is a trap that a lot of people on LinkedIn fall into. They fall into the mass appeal, and which is, we've all seen those posts. Like it could be something like, people don't leave jobs, they leave managers. And everyone goes, yes, thousands of people. And that you can be tricked into thinking that that's building like a robust brand, but it's not. And so it's, again, even that is a balance, because you're managing like the dopamine and all of these things. So
yeah, because you're human. You want to feel like it feels great to get those likes and stuff. But then when you look back, it's like, I say it to myself, it's like, I don't want to go viral, because my post that like a lot of people see, then you go like coming down from that to get back to your regular content and the audience that you want. And I mean, we're doing this for a reason, right? You and I do this full time. We're doing it for a reason. Like there's goals. It's not just likes and stuff like that. It's like, I can't pay my mortgage with likes.
Which I think you can to a certain degree, and what I mean by that is like if I'm going to a brand, for example, and I say to them, hey, I got millions of views and I got millions, like I'm going to be able to charge more for certain things. Obviously with like speaking, if you've got a big following, you can start to leverage things. So I think that because I hear people say that a lot, and it's like the likes don't pay the bills, and it's like, well, I think it can if you know what you're doing with it. But to your point, there are definitely a lot of people, and it's usually people who usually they're not in the B2B space. They also usually exploded at some point with not really a plan or an intention. That's where the likes don't pay the bills. And I think on LinkedIn, for example, which I do actually think that like that's a hard platform to monetize if you haven't like really thought it out, or like you don't have the strategy behind it, or you're not having conversations. And out of all the platforms, I think it's the most lucrative if you can figure out how to convert those likes into brand deals, and you can get into that world. But it's also the one where I see most people with big followings, they're not making any money at all. And it kind of goes back to what we said, where it's like, who is your actual, like, what's the audience like that's going to drive you, either business that's not to do with content, or if you are looking to be like an influencer and do brand deals, what's the audience you're building that brands are going to want to reach? And a lot of people aren't thinking that. They just think, "Whoa, I've got 100,000 followers." Well, who are those 100,000 followers? And like,
exactly, because when you have those conversations with brands, they ask you that question.
They always do. And then they're gonna expect results. And I've seen it. And I'm not gonna obviously name any names at all, but I've talked to founders and people who have worked with influencers who have really, really bigger followers than me. I got like 200,000 followers on my personal, like 50 on my business page, which that's a lot. That's a lot of, we're talking 250,000 people. It's an enormous amount. But they're talking to people who have bigger followings than me, and then they try and they do like some sort of like promotion, and there's no conversion there. And I think the thing that I actually see the most, which is not talked about enough, is when you go to their video section, if you got 2 videos or 3 videos, you got no brand. brand is just, it's built through long form video, short form video, audio. It's got to be more than just a written post, unless you're gonna go, maybe like a Justin Welsh. He's probably one of the people who I think has done it miraculously without doing any video content. But he's also selling like a 1.99 widget almost, but that's not a scalable, repeatable model for most people. And again, it just has created this whole weird ecosystem on LinkedIn. But I think like the video and like this type of content, this is powerful, because if we've only got 10 people listening right now to this, but all of those 10 people are decision makers, they hold a budget, they're engaged in it, there's a high likelihood you can get a good conversion even out of just 10 people or 40 people or 50 people, versus 3,000 people liking a post on LinkedIn that's like 3 lines but zero substance. I'd take those 10 listeners that are listening for hours and are really engaged versus 3,000 people that just in a second click something and then scrolled on.
Yeah, and that totally applies. So most of the people who listen to this show are recruiters. They're not necessarily like you and I who want to do this full time, who are professional content creators. They're creating content to attract either clients or candidates. So in your opinion, what makes great recruiting content?
I think it's knowing, knowing, number one, what's the goal, right? Because some people it is just going to be candidates. Great. Some people it's going to be clients. So knowing that ICP, knowing what they care about. An ICP, what is that? It's like a ideal client profile or whatever. So and that would still work with candidates. Like I think you can think about it in the same exact way, but knowing what they care about. So when I train people on what's the type of content you want to post about, I've changed my mind over this over the years, because it used to be very much like, post some personal stuff, post some solutions to their problems, and then talk about some of your kind of wins that you've had, which I think is actually a fine model. But the problem was it was missing one key component, and that's the news. Like, and I think this is an area that recruiters, they miss out, because when people come to a recruiter, it's for 2 reasons. For job seekers, they want to know, do you have any jobs for me? And then for the clients, they want the biggest question you ever get as a recruiter is, tell me about the market. What's going on in the market? So I think a great recruiting content, you understand your candidates or your clients and what they care about, and that's what you're posting about. So if, let's say I'm recruiting software engineers, and it's someone who does really good job with this is a guy called Taylor Desson. If you don't know Taylor, go check out Taylor. That's like, he always done so good, and he gets invited to like tech conferences to speak as a recruiter, which is like, how does that even happen? But when you look at his content, he's not really focused on trying to go viral or likes. He's like telling a story, consistency. He's built a community of tech people, but he talks a lot about stuff that they care about. And so he's talking about the news and talking about how's AI going to impact these technologies, and how can you leverage more money in an interview. So just think about the people that you're trying to reach. What do they care about? And then you want to be that go-to person. And it's a long game. This is not like a short game. It's a long game. Just like any other relationship is a long game. A relationship doesn't happen in an hour. Like, because people be like, well, what about, like a phone call? And I think, okay, well, the phone call isn't a relationship. Like, multiple phone calls over a period of time and meeting real life over years is a relationship. And it's that same idea with social media. It's like you're creating a relationship with your audience over time, a longer time, but it's talking about things they care about versus what you think that they care about or what you care about. And I think that's the stage that people don't always get to that point. Now, if you look at my content, the way that I do this is I do a lot of humor. And number one, it's because I just like to laugh, and I think I'm funny. And like when I meet people, like I usually am like the jokester. I've always been the jokester. But number two, I'm like, man, recruiters, like you gotta have a sick sense of humor to be a recruiter. So they all resonate with it, and they just resonate with the unpredictability of people in our job. And so when you look at my content, that's what I've thought about, and that was from years of creating content and then realizing why. I took a page out of Adam Karpiak, if you guys know Adam on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
He talks a lot about, from a job seeker's perspective, he talks a lot about the hiring process, how screwed up it is. I was like, I kind of want to be like the Adam Karpiak for recruiters. So I'm gonna talk about I'm gonna make content for recruiters. And at the time I was recruiting recruiters, and that's why I went that direction.
Okay.
Right. And it's turned into something else, but that's always my advice for people is think about who that small market is and just speak to them, speak to them, speak to them. You don't need to appeal to everybody in the world, but you want that community of candidates, that industry to think of you as you are one of the recruiters that I respect and I follow. And you do that over the long term. That's how everything in recruitment, everything in sales just gets easier and easier and easier.
I like everything you've been saying. I've been like, yes, 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 because it's like this week I've had a lot of workshops that I do workshops for companies, and I've done LinkedIn lives and things like that about this topic, and I've been talking a lot about storytelling for recruiters and how to incorporate that into your content. And everyone's always like, well, but what do I talk about? And it's like, as recruiters, we have this information. It's so easy. Like, what questions are people asking you at the end of an interview?
Exactly.
When you say hey, do you have any questions for us? Those questions, turn that stuff into content. And then
Exactly.
you won't have to be answering it over and over again. Cause I know as a recruiter, that I got bored of answering the same questions over and over. And then it's it appeals to people. If three of your candidates ask you the same thing, trust me, 100 want to know.
Write it down.
Yeah.
I think Amy Millett, she does a good job of that, on her YouTube channel. But then this is the other thing that happens is whenever I bring up any kind of content, recruiters are always going, well, someone else is saying this, someone else saying that. And I think that's because your whole feed is recruiters, because most of us recruiters like to connect with other recruiters. I don't know why. It's just a weird thing we do instead of connecting with candidates, but we love to connect with other recruiters. So our whole news feed is full of Amy Miller or Andrew Lewis or these guys who are just posting stuff, and you look at it and go, well, they just said something about resumes. So then we need to wake up to the fact that I think I've got 800,000 followers on social media, and guess what? I go out in public and nobody knows who the hell I am. I'm not a celebrity because when you look at LinkedIn's user base, even there's 1 billion users. Okay, so I might have 200,000 of them who clicked follow at one point. Who knows how engaged any of those people are really engaged? It's not like I've got 200,000 people who are obsessed with me. Just like Gary Vee has 5 million followers, but it doesn't mean that 5 million people are always liking his posts. He gets 2,000 likes, so it's actually a low percentage. But my point is there, and even with Gary Vee, I talked to my neighbor the other day. I said, hey, yeah, do you know who Gary Vee is? No idea. And so I think you just have to put that out of the way and go, look, I'm just going to put good value information and helpful information, and you'll be surprised. I've had neighbors come up to me. I had my neighbor, I hate to say it, but I don't even know. I can't remember her name, but she was like, yeah, my husband, he's been looking for a job, and he just came across your content. It's been super helpful. And I'm like, that is insane. But I could have sat back and go, well, I'll just let the other people who are putting out I'll let this other guy do it. And I think you got to get out of that mindset and just realize and the other thing too then is we think, oh, well, everything I know is simple. Oh, this is just basic information. Well, let me just tell you, basic information is to you is highly valuable information, because it's just, you deal with this stuff all the time. You deal with the resumes, you deal with the hiring managers, the process. Candidates don't. They only deal with it when they're looking for a job, which is maybe 2 or 3 times in their lifetime. If they're, if they've gotten laid off, it's not something that happens every day. And so we can think, oh, this is just so basic, but it's actually not basic. It's just stuff that you've known. And like anything, if you do something a lot, it does become basic to you, but it's highly valuable to other people. And so I always tell recruiters, keep that in mind. It's okay to say the same thing as someone else. You're going to get different people respond. And some of those people will be like, wow, that's mind blowing. I never knew that. And if you want to get confirmation, go on TikTok and look at all the terrible content that's on there that goes viral. It's we owe people this.
Yeah, that's a great thing. It's you owe people putting out good content and good advice. And also, yeah, Amy Miller has a ton of followers. You have a ton of followers. But just because you've talked about a topic or Amy's talked about a topic doesn't mean that my way of talking about the topic is different. And also, it doesn't mean that, I'm sure I have followers who don't follow you, because that's just the nature of how this works.
Look, it will exactly, and that's what I'm saying. Even like Justin Welsh, he's got like hundreds. He's probably got millions of followers now on like across these
Yeah.
platforms. Trust me, go into a gas station and be like, "Do you know who Justin Welsh is?" And be like, "Who? I don't know, you know that." I was thinking about it the other day. I was listening to like an old it was like Twista and Kanye West song, and it's like I was thinking in my head, I was like, I wonder if I went to like teenagers today, I was like, "Do you know Twista?" They'd be like, "Who?" Because it's just like it was like relevant back in '05 when I was when I was there, but like these and that's it's a celebrity, so it's I think we again it kind of goes back to that whole idea of like your own individual content. Like you think everybody's like really dialed in and tuned in. It's like no, probably not as much as you think,
Yeah.
and that's coming from someone who is like I look at some of the view time on my videos. I'm like, oh my gosh, this has been viewed like you know, days and years worth of amount of time, but no one really knows who I am, right? It's crazy. At RecFest, which I'm going to, a lot of the recruiters know me, which is great. But as soon as I exit out of recruiter and job search world, it's like it's not like I'm getting free sandwiches at McDonald's.
I
No one's giving me any
know.
hookups.
So another thing I've heard a lot as far as when I talk to people about creating content, a lot of companies and recruiters are afraid of getting canceled or like saying something wrong and that gets
Yeah.
them canceled, especially on video. Have you ever created something that almost got you canceled?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm very careful with the topics that I talk about, and again, it's hard to get canceled over cover letters, and so, but I think you got to know like your lane with things as well, and I think you've always got to be able to, if you make a point, and this is where like sometimes people will post stuff just to go viral, right, or just because they want to do something to kind of be seen, and the problem is if you can't back it up and like kind of defend it if you have to, then you're gonna run into issues, and then you also like just in general, you gotta anticipate. And LinkedIn's is probably the safest of all places in this way because everyone's work is tied into it. Some of these other platforms, you're gonna get trolls and things like that. But again, it's like you just gotta know like what your lane is and what you're gonna talk about. And now, look, if you feel very, very passionate about D&I, for example, but don't you're not like an expert, or you don't actually like you're just kind of making statements, like you're gonna say things that are gonna resonate with some people and are gonna really not resonate with other people, and maybe you say something polarizing. But I think if you're gonna go that direction, then again, it's like you got to be a practitioner, you got to be able to back it up, and you got to understand why you're saying what you're saying. I think for me, like the only time ever that has actually that I've said something which like people came after me on was, funnily enough, I copy and pasted a post from TikTok, and it was just kind of like it was a what I would consider like kind of a hustle kind of post. It was like, oh,
Okay.
wake up at 6 a.m. It was something like that, and a lot of people jumped on the post about it, and at the end of the day, I got to a point where it had so many comments. I was like, you know what, I'm actually just gonna delete this and walk away, and that was it. It was like sometimes we create these online worlds where it's like we just read into things. But again, most of what I talk about is like cover letters, resumes, interview advice. It's not like I'm like taking stands on like politics or like social justice or things like that. And sometimes people challenge me in that and like, well, why don't you talk about what you think and things? And I'm like, well, that's not my platform, and it's actually not what I'm choosing to talk about. And I think you have to be comfortable with like not talking about everything. And if you feel pressure in that way, to me, like that's not a reason to post something just because people are pressuring you into things as well. Like it's a full package, right? And it's you who you're putting yourself out there. And so yeah, it's a long answer to I don't run into that a lot. And I would say
Yeah.
99% of recruiters, I don't know why that would necessarily even be like a fear. The only thing I could think about is like you post something about not ghosting, and then someone you ghosted like calls you out on it. That would
Yeah,
be
and then
my
you
only
just say
thing with
sorry and
recruiters.
move on.
Move on.
Like
Exactly.
it's yeah, it's just And you brought up a good point. Like, if you're going to talk about a topic that you're not very familiar with, like, let's say you want to address something about DEI or something like that, then do a video with someone else who is an expert about this. And then ask them questions. And yes, you've created content about that, and you brought on someone who actually knows. And I think it's very important to remember the responsibility you have
Yeah.
with a platform, whether you have one follower or a million followers. Whoever is looking or reading or watching your content, is you have the responsibility of providing good information that you believe is true and you stand by. So I think as long as you do that, you're not going to get canceled. And if someone that, yeah, if you talk about ghosting and someone that you ghosted says like, well, you ghosted me in 2003, it's like, well, sorry, I was a baby recruiter in 2003 and I made some mistakes, and just like
Exactly.
move on.
And I will say too, like I've had, and this is something which like probably only recently in like the last 6 months, like I've really kind of dealt with, and that was, I went through like a phase where I was pretty snarky with comments, and I mean, that's okay, and there's a lot of recruiters who kind of play that game where like they'll find a post they don't agree with, and then they got to leave that comment on it, and that's fine. And like and again, it's like everyone has their own choices. But I ended up having somebody like basically send me like threatening emails, and my wife was pregnant, and it was just kind of like weird. It's just a weird threatening to sue me and all this sort of stuff. And I just started a business and tagged a lawyer on there, and my wife was freaking out, and it was this whole thing. And I kind of just made a decision where I was like, why am I being snarky? Like, because most people when they meet me, they're like, oh, you're a nice guy. And I'm like, so why am I trying to play this like sarcastic person? And like, and I thought like, okay, well, what do I want? What do I even want my brand to be? And how do I want people to think about? And now I'm like, I stayed away from that. And it's just changed everything. So I don't get as much stuff like that. And if someone does comment something that seems to be stirring the pot, I usually just leave it alone. And I've just kind of given myself permission of like, this is not, it's real life, but it's not like human interaction. And I think the truth is, in whatever context, I think the most powerful, or the way that you see people become themselves when it's a one-on-one actual face-to-face interaction. People become least themselves when it's like online and you've got like a group of people around you. And then it's the same like in real life, right? That's why you see like 100 people storming into something and like, looting. You can kind of hide in the crowd, but to do that just by yourself, you probably not gonna. It's almost a guarantee all 100 of those people would not do that by themselves.
Yeah.
So I think you've got to have that mentality, because what I'll see sometimes is like there's like a pack mentality online where someone will post something and then it's like, the hounds will come from like lots of people. But what I realized, I've met actually some people who trolled me online, and then we get along offline. And so I kind of keep that in mind where I'm like, no matter what, like when you meet people face to face, one on one, it's always different. And even if people are like in a group, they are like hateful. A lot of times when you're actually putting that one on one situation, they're not actually that way, because there's like a humanity thing that happens a lot of the time, right? Not all of the time, but I would say more than most of the time. I would say that happens. And again, I've seen it so many times where like I'll run into somebody at an event and we maybe had a disagreement. So they might have even said something. Maybe I even block them, and then it's like so much different in person. So I've kind of just like disconnected myself from that side of things. I think if that's something you're concerned about, just always know, like, number one, if someone comments on something, someone sends you a DM, you have zero obligation. You don't owe anybody anything. And the worst thing you can do is like over emotionalize it internally and like let it own you for an hour or 2 hours. And I think anyone who created content knows exactly what I'm talking about. But it's like you got to get past that and just go, look, I'm not going to focus on the one. I'm going to focus on the 99 people who are like, go Joel, go Rona, like you guys are amazing, versus the one who's like, well, you guys don't know what you're talking about, right?
Yeah. It's give yourself permission to ignore people. Like, it's literally super easy. It's way easier than in real life.
It's
Someone
so
comments
easy.
something, you can just ignore the comment and move on. And like I do this all the time. Like sometimes someone comments something and you're like, and I'm like, you know what? I'm mad. I'm not even responding to this comment. Next. Like
Exactly.
that's it.
Unfortunately, it took me like a long time to get to that point. And it's the same with a comparison thing. It's like you said, like we're doing this for a reason, right? And it's like you can get compare, you start to compare and like you make judgments of like where people are at business wise. And like, again, I've had to just go, okay, I'm just going to focus on like what I'm doing and try and support other people, but I don't want to just get into this comparison loop either. And then also it's just like I don't know why people don't talk about this more, but it's like this social like I was telling my wife this the other day. I was like, sometimes like I fall into a trap of like it's become validation for me for like my identity as well, like how many likes I can get, and it's like I have to almost work through that and be like, look, if I do a post and it gets 10 likes, like that doesn't mean I'm like useless or like I have zero value as a person. But it's like when your business is tied to that and like your validation stuff you got to work through. And again, I don't think most people who are listening to this would even want to get to that scale, but it's just, I think it's helpful to know like some of these pitfalls that you can just fall into, or like maybe you do post and you're like, oh, nobody liked it. It's like, it doesn't mean that nobody likes you. It's just, they didn't see it because you're not on their news feed that they're looking at for like 10 minutes, or, it's like there
And
are
also,
algorithms and stuff, right?
yeah, and also people don't always like things. It's like when I was actively recruiting and creating content, there were many times where I would post something that would like get like 2 or 3 likes, and it was like my mom's best friend who she likes everything on my LinkedIn. And yeah, I love her. She supports me in everything. And like things like that. It was like 1 or 2 people, like my boss, my mom's best friend, and someone else.
Yeah.
But then I get on call, I would get on my regular calls that day with candidates, and they would be like, I saw that video that you posted about this and this and this. That was so great. I want to ask more, because it was about the company I was recruiting for, because I've been doing internal recruiting for a long time. So I would post things that were about the company, and that would spark conversations. They didn't like the video
No. And why
for
would they? Because
whatever
it's like
reason.
they were not gonna like, again, if you're recruiting, like people don't want to say, like they don't want to like it because they know it's going to show up on their boss's feed. Like, why are you liking what this recruiter is saying? Or like, how do you know this person? And like LinkedIn is definitely one of those platforms where most people are like feel awkward on the platform still. And unless you're like used to it and you're creating content, that's like awkward. It's awkward, and people like don't know how to approach it. Even though we, like Facebook and Instagram, we're totally fine to just like hit like or repost or share. There is a different culture on LinkedIn. And I actually had a client who I'm coaching one-on-one, and he said that he's like, yeah, it's like my uncle, my brother, my family. And I was like, yeah, but look at how many minutes of view time. Like you had like 3 hours of view time on this video. That's amazing. That's, that means
Yeah,
people
your
are
uncle didn't
seeing
watch
it.
it for 3 hours.
No, you watched it for 3. He's like, wait, I watched it for 3. No, but I think that to your point, it's and we just get caught on hooked in the wrong things, I think, with this stuff. And I think when you think about LinkedIn as a platform, which most recruiters are on, you usually connect with people people that you've worked with. And I just think of like, when I think of content nowadays, I literally think of like, my mindset is like, okay, if I'm like FaceTiming one person, what would I say to them, kind of knowing that there might be 10 people or 20 people. And I think we sensationalize these numbers as well. And like, obviously, like you might hear on mine, like, oh, millions, and go, millions is the goal. And I'm like, no, from a recruiting standpoint, if you've got 10 roles to fill, then 10 is the goal. If you're running your own business and your deal size is 25K or 50K, for 2 deals, then guess what? 2 is the goal. If you're a solopreneur business person, same thing. Like you run a coaching clinic and it's 10K, and you think, oh, I could use 5 clients, then 5's a goal. Not a million, 5 of
Yeah.
the right people. And I think again, it trips people up, and they're like, oh, well, if I'm not getting this, and I'm like, you don't need the I don't know where this mass appeal even came from, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I had an entire episode of talking about that with James
Oh
Ellis
yeah,
that
yeah.
I'll link for people to watch. But it's like companies are obsessed with this, like more candidates. We want to appeal to everyone. We want everyone to love us. Like
Top of
that's not
funnel
even our
metric,
goal.
right? top of funnel, like how many applicants. Because hiring managers, that's what they're. Oh, got any new candidates for me? Instead of asking like, do you have any of like the right candidates? Like, and I swear, hiring managers would rather have 10 bad candidates than one great candidate. It's like,
Yeah.
what are those metrics? Doesn't
Yeah,
make
so
any
having
sense.
having those conversations. Another thing that a lot of recruiters run into is their leadership sees creating content as like a waste of time, because I guess because it's such of a long game. How do
Yeah.
you balance when you were recruiting and creating content? How did you balance doing both things and find time for it?
I was really lucky on the first company when I started creating content. I wouldn't say lucky, but the CEO of the company, number one, I knew him. I've known him for a long time, so that made it a lot easier. But also his mentality was very much like, or the mentality of the culture of the company was like being an entrepreneurial, and so I was like, well, creating content. This is my entrepreneur thing. Like this is me thinking outside of the box, and that's something they celebrated. So I think if you're in the right culture, that shouldn't be a problem. I actually see, and I think if you're working at a really large company, and I was talking to the chief people officer at a really large company, we are having this exact conversation, and he was like, well, I don't know why aren't we just not like why aren't we just hitting record and having conversations? I was like, well, because nowadays you can say the wrong thing and people lose millions of dollars. And so bigger companies, man, you say the wrong thing, stock price gets hit, it's literally costing people money. And so I think you got to know your company, you got to know what their thoughts are. And when I started creating content, I was working for this company where it was very entrepreneurial, and then the next company I went to work with, it was a similar thing. Like they really believed in content. So I got into organizations where this was acceptable. I think to the ROI point, if company leaders are questioning the ROI, I guess I would look at like, because I talked to some of these recruiting teams that maybe they've got 60 people on a recruitment team. Number one thing I always tell people to do is like, don't jump into creating the content right away. Look at the content that's already been created by your marketing team or on your LinkedIn page. And if you have, if I go to your marketing page and those LinkedIn posts have 2 likes and there's 60 people on the recruiting team, like that's an opportunity to hit like and hit
Yeah.
repost. And what you do is, and there's no doubt in my mind that if every recruitment team who's listening just went, we're going to get really behind the marketing team, there's no doubt in my mind that number one, when hiring goes down, they're going to question, they're still going to know that you're bringing value, which is just like it's content distribution. And so, when I go to a company, I see 20 recruiters, 40 recruiters, and I go to the marketing page and there's like 1 like, I'm like, you're already messing up, right? And so like just start to engage first and get into that. And just show, don't tell. Like, I think in my experience, telling people what an ROI is hard. Showing them the ROI is a lot easier. So if I go to a client and go, hey, I just got you 50,000 impressions, they're like, oh my gosh. But if I told them I was going to get the 50,000 impressions, they're like, okay. And so if you start with that engagement and getting behind what the marketing team's doing, you're making an impact. They are going to see an impact, whether it's leads, impressions, whatever KPIs they have set out. And then the conversation starts and you go, look, we've been engaging with the team and like, look at how our impressions have gone up on our follower and are we generating new leads? We need to do the same thing from a recruitment perspective. The challenge with
Yeah.
that is I think if someone's going to lead this, it's going to be hard for an individual contributor recruiter to do it. And with any of these changes, you need someone who is, at the executive level or a founder or somebody who's in a position to have a seat at that table with the conversation. And so like this is to the chief people officers, the chief human resources officers, people who are leading. You have to instigate this and you have to believe in it. If you're an IC and you're not in that environment, it's going to be hard, right? Because you don't even get that
Yeah.
conversation with the CFO or whoever making those decisions.
Yeah, I think as an IC, the most that you can do is what I did in a environment where it wasn't like so well received. It was part of my sourcing. You want me to source? This is how I source.
Yeah,
So let's say I had the ability to spend 3 hours a day sourcing. An hour of that was creating content. And that
Cool.
helped my other sourcing. So there are always ways to like weave it in, and yeah, be mindful and don't go and say things about your company if that's not accepted and things like that. But I think there's always a way to find time. You just have to be creative because there is a goal behind what you're doing. And if it's sourcing, then this is part of your sourcing strategy type of
Yeah,
thing.
and look, you start creating content, you build up awareness, and then data is also a great way to show it. So let's say, hey, before I started creating content, my email acceptance rate was 15%. Now that I started creating content, it's 25%. Great. Now you can attribute that to there's just more awareness, and there's more awareness. And I would also say, like, one of the things that I've thought a lot about with just creating content as recruiters that's underrated is, yes, the candidates we obviously want more candidates, but there's also this side which I think recruiters struggle with more than even sourcing candidates and reaching out to them, and that is getting hiring managers bought into them trusting you for your candidates. Because there's nothing worse. If a hiring manager doesn't trust you, you can send them candidates that are not going to work with them. And so the number one thing that a lot of recruiters say is, I wish I had more time with my hiring managers. So I say, well, look, if you put out helpful information, see 3 videos a week, helpful information, guess who's going to see that? Because you connected to them on LinkedIn, your hiring manager. And then there's this weird thing that happens. There's this thing called social proof. And if they see you doing something, it's like you're an expert. If you're making videos on what's going on in the industry, they're going to view you as an expert. And then you send them candidates and you have that trust built in. And so, again, what are the questions that hiring managers ask? Well, what's the market like? What is our competition doing? How is this going to impact hiring? What are the salary bands? Like, you can create content around that, and then they start to see you as that trusted person. And again, I think it's harder if you're just starting out in recruitment. I hear that, and that can be a challenge. But for those recruiters who are, 3, 5, 10 years in, you are actually a subject matter expert, but you can actually use content to get that face time that you want. And it's the same with C-suite, right? Because you're going to be connected with them. So there's this other side of it where it's like, yes, candidates, yes, employer brand, but what about just building trust with the business and having them see you as this person's credible? Because there is a thing, it's that social proof, right? And that helps then for the other side where, like, hey, you can source 10 amazing candidates that are the best fit ever. But if that hiring manager doesn't have that trust, good luck. Good luck.
Yeah. And that works for agency recruiters and for internal. It has worked for me for internal. I remember once I posted some advice about like how to interview, like as an interviewer.
Yep.
My hiring managers started asking me questions. Obviously, no one liked that video. They didn't like it because every hiring manager wants to be the expert at hiring. They know how to interview. But on the side, those conversations were great, and it builds that trust. And that's when one of my content pillars back then started to
So
be
smart.
like, yeah, I was like, these are the questions that they have that they're asking, and it brought value. It brings the trust, and then any candidates I would present, and I'm working internally, we're coworkers. It levels up your relationship.
And this is the juxtaposition with recruitment is you're dealing with people on both sides that know more about the position than you, and you're given, in an ideal world, you're the one that's almost making a decision of like who in the pool of candidates that we have going through, based on what the hiring manager has said, based on the job description, based on the information you have, and then understanding the resume and the conversation, you're the one who's making a decision of who I'm going to present to the hiring manager. And then the hiring manager is then making a decision of who they actually want to see and have the conversation with. But in that, it's like when it comes to the knowledge level and the credibility, you're actually the lowest person on there. With the candidate, especially with technical, they're not always going to have respect for you as a recruiter. So any way that you can build that up changes everything. And this is where, like, again, that valuable and being a thought leader. Now, sometimes it's you creating content, but it could also, I was thinking about that example with like interviews, right? There's a company out there that their founders, they post a lot of information around data around interviews, like who's speaking, how are they speaking. Like that type of content would be great if you reposted it, or you reposted it with your thought on there. Like, so you don't always have to be the one that's necessarily like creating it or coming up with that, but maybe you're sharing that and going, that this is great advice. But again, it's like your name's associated with it. As long as you put your thoughts on there, they see that, and then you're elevated. And then you don't get that complaint from that, that engineer that's just like, oh yeah, just another recruiter that doesn't know anything or has this agenda. So I think that example that you just described was like, is super smart. And it's like, because you'd love to have that one-on-one conversation with them and like, hey, this is how we do a scorecard. This is how we make decisions. When are you going to get that? Right. But you can make that content, and then suddenly the next thing you find, they're like, hey, can you come train our team on how to do this?
Exactly. Yeah. And literally that happened from that content. That's how I started my workshop on interviewing for hiring teams. It started from me
That's so
just posting
cool.
a video about it. And then that snowballed into all the things that I do today. So it's just,
I think you said that with like the top voice badge that you got as well. It was like you're not going in there to be like, oh, I want to be a top voice, or like, oh, I want to have millions and millions of followers. I remember you said to me, I started putting out valuable content that I cared about, that I thought was helpful, going to be helpful to people in my network. And then somebody who makes the decision to, hey, this person's a top voice, they found the content helpful and engaging and valuable. And I think what I love about that is it's kind of that common thread, right? It's like you talk about things you like and that you're an expert in, and then the rest, it just kind of takes care of itself. And it's but I would say, like, for a lot of recruiters out there, if you're listening, you feel like, oh, this is great, this is amazing, but I just don't know if I have that expertise or that subject matter expertise. It's like, I just want to tell you right now, you do more than you think. But there is that, I think for both of us, we would both say, like, yes, sure, there's probably times of like imposter syndrome and these things, but you do also have to, like, you got to take that step and go, you know what, I believe that I actually do know what I'm talking about. And I believe that I have expertise in these things. And you got to have that confidence level to be able to step out. And that's something that you can only really decide. Like, again, with creativity, you've got to think you're creative to be creative. I know I've fantastically creative people, but I tell you what, they all think, they all know that they're creative, or they believe that they're creative as well. And it's almost like you have to have that self-belief in there as well, I think, to get started. So anyone who's listening to this, I'm like, just believe in it. Just like, you are a subject matter expert. So start sharing that,
And candidates always say that you don't know what you're recruiting for. Hiring managers think you don't know. Guess what? You're the subject matter expert in hiring.
Exactly.
That's why you're a recruiter. That's what you talk about. You don't want to be a software engineer, so you don't try to be an expert in software engineering, right? You're an expert in recruiting. You're an expert in hiring. Stand in that power and create content and talk about that. And like, you are an expert. So I love that you call that out. So this has been an awesome conversation.
Yes, I've loved it.
I'm so excited to share it. Where can listeners find you if they want to connect with you?
Yeah, I just go to www.therealistrecruiter.com. It's my website. I've got list all my socials on there. I've also got a podcast called Recruiting is No Joke, and all of the podcast episodes are on the podcast page on the website. But yeah, if you go there, then you can kind of pick and choose where you want to find me. In terms of like LinkedIn, which is obviously where I'm at as well, I am maxed out at maximum connections, which is 30,000. Believe it or not, it happens once you just get over a certain amount of followers. But what I always say is, like, if you send me a connection request, say that you heard me on the podcast, I do DM everybody back. So, and it's not AI. It's a copy and pasted message. It's not AI. It's me. I have to copy and paste each individual one. But then that means that we can DM as well. And so it's kind of a hack around the whole limitation. Only difference is instead of saying like one, or second, it's going to say second degree connection, but we can still DM. So it's basically the same thing. So yeah, just go to the www.therealistrecruiter. That's what this sign says if it's cut off. And yeah, if you just go there, you'll be able to find all my information.
Amazing. And there you have it, folks. Joel just dropped some serious gems about creating recruiting content that actually works. Remember, it's not about reinventing the wheel every time you post. It's about consistency, understanding what your audience cares about, and yes, repeating yourself, but in fresh, engaging ways. Whether you're just starting out or you're looking to level up your content game, Joel's advice is gold. Find your niche, embrace your expertise, and don't be afraid to hit that record button. The only thing I would add is get really good at storytelling. That's why I've created a free 7-day email course, Storytelling for Recruiters. This course teaches you how to proactively answer the questions that job seekers really want to know about your company. It's based on an anonymous survey I ran, asking job seekers what they'd ask in an interview if they knew their chances of being hired wouldn't be impacted. To sign up, visit ronapierce.com/storytelling. The link is in the show notes. And if you want to learn even more about attracting candidates with your content, make sure to check out episode 14, where I chat with Taylor Desson about building online talent communities. Trust me, it's the perfect companion to today's episode. Thanks for listening, and I'll chat with you next week.